The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military base camp, where dozens of canvas GP tents stood in neat rows like temporary monuments to order and discipline. Inside the largest tent, which served as the temporary command center, the air was thick with tension and the smell of strong coffee that had been brewing since dawn. Captain Marcus Rodriguez sat quietly in the corner, his weathered hands wrapped around a metal cup of lukewarm coffee. His uniform, though clean and pressed, bore the subtle signs of a man who had seen real combat. Small patches where insignia had been moved, a slight fade on the shoulders where equipment had rubbed, and boots that had walked through more than parade grounds. At 42, Marcus had the kind of presence that spoke without words, but today he chose to remain silent among the younger officers who filled the tent with their animated conversations. The morning briefing had just concluded, and the atmosphere had shifted from formal military protocol to the more relaxed chatter that often followed such meetings. It was during these moments that personalities emerged from behind rank and regulation, sometimes revealing character and sometimes exposing its absence. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwell, a man in his mid-30s with perfectly pressed uniforms and an impeccable military bearing, stood near the center of the tent holding court with several junior officers. Hartwell had earned his rank through a combination of military academy excellence, strategic positioning, and an undeniable talent for impressing his superiors. His record was spotless, his efficiency ratings exceptional, and his ambition barely concealed behind a veneer of military professionalism. The problem with some people in this man's army, Hartwell was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the tent, is that they think experience trumps proper advancement through the ranks. He gestured with his coffee cup, and several of the younger officers nodded in agreement, though some looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Captain Rodriguez continued to sit quietly, seemingly absorbed in his own thoughts. He had heard variations of this speech before, in different tents, different bases, different years. The underlying message was always the same. There was a right way and a wrong way to advance in the military, and some people took shortcuts or relied too heavily on field experience rather than following proper protocol. Take someone like our captain over there, Hartwell continued, his voice dropping slightly but still audible to most of the tent's occupants. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being a career captain. Someone has to do the job, right? But after 20 years in the service, you'd think a man would have found a way to advance beyond that rank if he truly had what it takes for leadership. The tent grew noticeably quieter. Several of the junior officers shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Hartwell and Rodriguez. The comment hung in the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated fire, spreading and settling over everyone present. Rodriguez raised his eyes from his coffee cup for the first time since the conversation began. His expression remained calm, almost serene, but there was something in his gaze that suggested depths these younger officers had never fathomed. He took a slow sip of his coffee and returned his attention to the contents of his cup. I mean, let's be honest here. Hartwell pressed on, perhaps encouraged by what he interpreted as Rodriguez's lack of response. In today's military, advancement requires more than just showing up and doing your job. It requires vision, strategic thinking, the ability to see the bigger picture. Some people are content to remain at the tactical level their entire careers. Second Lieutenant Davis, one of the newest officers in the unit, looked particularly uncomfortable. He had arrived at the base only 2 weeks earlier, fresh from officer training, and was still learning the dynamics of military politics. During his brief time there, he had noticed that Captain Rodriguez was universally respected by the enlisted men, who often sought him out for advice and guidance. But he had also observed that the captain rarely spoke during officer meetings and seemed to prefer the company of sergeants and corporals to that of his fellow officers. The thing is, Hartwell continued, warming to his theme, Some people mistake longevity for competence. They think that because they've been around for a while, they automatically deserve respect. But in the modern military, respect has to be earned through achievement, through advancement, through demonstrating that you have what it takes to lead at higher levels. First Lieutenant Morrison, who had served under Rodriguez during a previous deployment, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He remembered Rodriguez during a particularly difficult mission in Afghanistan, remembered the way the captain had handled himself under fire, remembered the decisions that had saved lives. But challenging a superior officer, even indirectly, was not something done lightly in the military hierarchy. Rodriguez finished his coffee and stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was not a large man, perhaps 5'10", with the lean build of someone who had spent decades maintaining military fitness standards, but there was something about his presence that seemed to fill more space than his physical dimensions would suggest. As he moved toward the tent's exit, several conversations that had been taking place in other parts of the tent gradually faded to silence. "Of course," Hartwell said, raising his voice slightly as if to ensure the captain would hear him. "I don't mean any disrespect. Everyone serves according to their abilities and their ambitions. Not everyone can be command material, and there's honor in recognizing your limitations." Rodriguez paused at the tent flap, his hand resting on the canvas. For a moment, it seemed as if he might turn around, might finally respond to the increasingly pointed comments that had been directed his way. Instead, he simply pushed through the flap and stepped out into the blazing desert heat. The tent remained silent for several long seconds after his departure. The younger officers exchanged glances, some looking confused, others appearing relieved that the uncomfortable moment had passed. Hartwell seemed pleased with himself, as if he had successfully made a point that needed making. "Well," he said, clapping his hands together, "I think we all have duties to attend to. Let's make sure we're setting the right example for our enlisted personnel." As the officers began to file out of the tent, none of them noticed the grizzled sergeant major who had been sitting in the shadows near the communications equipment, quietly monitoring radio traffic while the meeting took place. Sergeant Major William Thompson had been in the Army for 26 years, and in that time he had served with hundreds of officers. He had seen the good ones and the bad ones, the leaders and the politicians, the warriors and the bureaucrats. As he watched Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell straightening his uniform and preparing to leave the tent, Thompson shook his head slowly and returned his attention to the radio. 3 hours later, the routine of the military base was interrupted by the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the desert air. The UH-60 Blackhawk appeared as a dark speck against the blazing afternoon sky, growing larger and more distinct as it approached the landing zone marked out near the perimeter of the camp. Sergeant Major Thompson was the first to recognize the significance of the incoming aircraft. Unlike the regular supply runs and personnel transfers that arrived daily, this helicopter bore the distinctive markings of a high-priority transport. As it settled onto the makeshift helipad, raising clouds of sand and dust that sent nearby personnel scrambling for cover, Thompson could make out the figures of several high-ranking officials through the aircraft's windows. Word spread quickly through the camp that they were receiving an unscheduled visit from division headquarters. Within minutes, officers were emerging from their various duties, hastily checking their uniforms and making their way toward the landing zone. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell appeared from the administrative tent, his bearing immediately shifting into the formal posture he reserved for interactions with superior officers. As the helicopter's rotors wound down, the side door slid open, and 3 figures stepped out onto the sandy ground. The first was a colonel, whose uniform displayed ribbons and decorations that spoke of extensive combat experience. Behind him came a brigadier general, a woman in her early 50s whose reputation for tactical brilliance had preceded her to every assignment she had ever received. The third figure to emerge was perhaps the most unexpected. A civilian in a simple dark suit who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Captain Rodriguez had been inspecting equipment with a group of enlisted men when word of the visitors reached him. Unlike the other officers who were hurrying toward the landing zone, he continued with his inspection, checking serial numbers and maintenance logs with the same methodical attention he brought to every task. The visiting officials were quickly escorted to the command tent, where Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell took charge of the impromptu reception. Within an hour, word had spread throughout the camp that all available officers were to report to the command tent for an emergency briefing. The nature of the meeting remained unclear, but the presence of both military leadership and what appeared to be a high-ranking civilian suggested that something significant was taking place. As officers filed into the command tent, the atmosphere was markedly different from the morning's casual gathering. Formal military protocol was strictly observed, with officers standing at attention until given permission to be seated. The brigadier general took her position at the front of the tent, while the colonel and the civilian flanked her on either side. "Gentlemen," the general began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding large units in challenging situations. "We're here today because of a situation that has developed in the northern sector. Intelligence reports indicate that a high-value target has been located in a compound approximately 40 kilometers from this position." The tent remained silent as she continued her briefing. The target, she explained, was a terrorist leader whose capture had been a priority for multiple international agencies for more than 2 years. Recent intelligence had pinpointed his location, but the window of opportunity for action was extremely narrow. "The mission parameters are complex," she continued. "The compound is situated in difficult terrain, surrounded by civilians and heavily defended. Standard assault tactics would likely result in significant casualties and could allow the target to escape through a network of tunnels that intelligence believes exists beneath the facility." Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell listened intently, already calculating how such a high-profile mission might impact his career trajectory. Success in a complex operation like this could accelerate his advancement significantly, while failure could have the opposite effect. "What makes this situation particularly challenging," the colonel added, stepping forward, "is that we have reason to believe the target is planning to relocate within the next 72 hours. If he moves, it could be months before we have another opportunity like this." The civilian, who had remained silent throughout the military briefing, now spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority that suggested familiarity with high-stakes operations. "The political ramifications of this mission extend beyond military considerations," he said. "The target's capture could provide intelligence that prevents multiple planned attacks on civilian populations. The stakes, gentlemen, could not be higher." As the briefing continued, it became clear that the visiting officials were not simply providing information, but were actively seeking input from the officers present. They wanted to understand the capabilities and resources available at the base, and they were evaluating potential approaches to the mission. "The question before us," the brigadier general said, "is whether this unit has the capability to undertake such an operation with the resources currently available. We need honest assessments of tactical capabilities, personnel readiness, and logistical support." Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell was the first to respond. "General, I believe this unit is fully capable of executing a mission of this complexity. We have highly trained personnel, adequate equipment, and excellent coordination with air support assets." Other officers nodded in agreement, though several appeared less certain about the feasibility of the operation. The compound's location in difficult terrain, combined with the presence of civilians and the narrow window of opportunity, presented challenges that went beyond standard military operations. As the discussion continued, Captain Rodriguez remained silent in his corner of the tent. He had listened carefully to every detail of the briefing, mentally cataloging the tactical challenges and potential solutions, but he offered no comments or suggestions. His silence was noted by several of the visiting officials, particularly the colonel, who had been observing the dynamics among the local officers throughout the briefing. The mission would require a team leader with extensive experience in complex operations, the Brigadier General said. Someone who has demonstrated the ability to adapt to changing circumstances and make critical decisions under extreme pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell straightened slightly. General, I have led multiple successful operations and have extensive experience with multi-unit coordination. I would be honored to lead this mission. The tent remained quiet as the visiting officials exchanged glances. The civilian leaned forward slightly and spoke in his quiet, authoritative voice. Before we make any decisions about leadership, he said, I'd like to hear from Captain Rodriguez. Every head in the tent turned toward the corner where Rodriguez sat. The captain looked up from his hands, meeting the civilian's gaze with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the briefing. Sir, Rodriguez said simply, you have my attention. The civilian studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Captain, what's your assessment of this operation? Captain Rodriguez stood slowly, his movement deliberate and respectful. The tent had fallen completely silent, with every officer present focusing their attention on what appeared to be an unprecedented moment. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell's expression showed confusion and perhaps a hint of concern as he watched the exchange unfold. Sir, Rodriguez began, his voice steady and clear. The operation as described presents several significant challenges that would need to be addressed before any mission could be considered viable. The Brigadier General leaned forward slightly. Continue, Captain. Rodriguez moved to the center of the tent, his demeanor shifting subtly from the quiet observer he had been all morning to something more commanding. The terrain in the northern sector includes 3 major choke points that would limit both approach and extraction options. The presence of civilians requires a precision approach that standard assault tactics cannot provide. Additionally, the tunnel network beneath the compound suggests the target has multiple escape routes that would need to be simultaneously neutralized. The colonel nodded approvingly. Your assessment aligns with our intelligence reports. How would you address these challenges? The mission would require a small, highly skilled team capable of operating independently, Rodriguez continued. Air support would need to be coordinated with ground operations in a way that maintains the element of surprise while providing rapid extraction capabilities. Most importantly, the team leader would need extensive experience with hostage rescue operations and urban warfare in complex environments. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell could no longer contain himself. General, with respect, Captain Rodriguez is certainly knowledgeable. But this type of high-stakes operation requires command-level experience and the authority to coordinate with multiple units and agencies. The civilian spoke for the first time since asking his initial question. His voice remained quiet, but there was something in his tone that commanded immediate attention. Captain Rodriguez, he said, would you be surprised to learn that your name was specifically mentioned in the intelligence briefing that preceded this visit? Rodriguez met the civilian's gaze steadily. Sir, I would be interested to know in what context. The Brigadier General stood and walked to a briefcase that had been placed near her chair. She withdrew a thick folder and opened it as she spoke. Captain Marcus Rodriguez, 22 years of active service, 4 tours in Afghanistan, 3 in Iraq. Recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and the Purple Heart. A murmur ran through the tent as she continued reading. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell's face had gone pale, and several of the junior officers exchanged shocked glances. Former commander of the 5th Special Forces Group's Counter-Terrorism Unit, the general continued, led 17 successful hostage rescue operations, including the extraction of Ambassador Williams and his family from the embassy siege in Kabul, credited with developing the tactical protocols now used by special operations units throughout the military. The silence in the tent was now complete and absolute. Rodriguez remained standing at attention, his expression unchanged, as the general continued reading from his file. Voluntarily relinquished command position to serve as a regular line officer following the death of his son, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, in an IED explosion in Helmand Province. Declined multiple promotions and command assignments, requesting assignment to standard infantry units. The civilian stood and approached Rodriguez. Captain, the intelligence community has been tracking the target for 2 years. Every analysis we've conducted indicates that a successful operation would require someone with your specific experience and capabilities. Your name has been at the top of our list for this mission since we began planning it 6 months ago. Rodriguez looked around the tent, taking in the shocked expressions of his fellow officers. When his eyes met Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell's, he saw a mixture of embarrassment and dawning understanding. "Sir," Rodriguez said, addressing the civilian, "I appreciate the confidence, but I'm currently assigned to this unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell's command. Any mission assignment would need to go through proper channels." The Brigadier General stepped forward. "Captain, you're being temporarily reassigned to a joint task force under direct Pentagon authority. The mission parameters place it outside normal command structure." She turned to address the entire tent. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. Captain Rodriguez isn't just being asked to lead this operation. For the past 6 months, he has been serving as a consultant to the intelligence community, providing tactical analysis for counterterrorism operations throughout this region. His current assignment to this unit was specifically arranged to position him for this mission." Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell found his voice, though it was noticeably quieter than it had been earlier in the day. "General, I had no idea about Captain Rodriguez's background or his current role." The colonel who had arrived with the general spoke for the first time since the briefing began. "Lieutenant Colonel, Captain Rodriguez's background is need-to-know information. His request to serve in a reduced capacity following his personal loss was honored by the Pentagon, but his expertise has remained available for situations exactly like this one." Rodriguez finally spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that had not been present in the morning's conversations. "Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell, sir. You were not incorrect in your assessment earlier today. I have chosen to remain at the rank of captain, and I have chosen assignments that allow me to serve without the responsibilities of higher command. That was a personal decision based on personal circumstances." The tent remained silent as Rodriguez continued. "However, when the situation requires it, and when lives are at stake, I serve in whatever capacity I'm needed. This mission appears to be one of those situations." The civilian moved to the front of the tent, commanding everyone's attention. "Gentlemen, Captain Rodriguez will be leading a joint task force consisting of personnel from multiple units. The operation begins tomorrow at 400 hours. The captain will select his team and coordinate all aspects of the mission." He paused and looked directly at Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell. "Lieutenant Colonel, your unit will provide support personnel and logistical assistance as requested by Captain Rodriguez. For the duration of this operation, he has full operational authority." As the briefing concluded and the visiting officials prepared to leave, the atmosphere in the tent had completely transformed. Officers who had been casual observers that morning now understood they were witnessing something far beyond their normal experience. Rodriguez approached Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell as the other officers filed out of the tent. "Sir, I want you to know that your comments this morning were not inappropriate given the information you had available. In similar circumstances, I might have made similar observations." Hartwell met his eyes, and for the first time that day, his military bearing seemed genuine rather than performative. "Captain, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions based on incomplete information." "No apology necessary, sir," Rodriguez replied. "I prefer that people see me as I choose to present myself. It makes my actual job easier when it becomes necessary." As the two men shook hands, Sergeant Major Thompson approached them. "Captain," he said, I've been waiting 26 years to see something like what just happened here today. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since the morning began. Sergeant Major, I've been hoping for 26 years that it would never be necessary. The next morning, as Captain Rodriguez led his hand-picked team toward their helicopters, Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell watched from the command tent. The mission would prove successful, the target would be captured, and intelligence gathered would prevent multiple terrorist attacks. But for Hartwell and the other officers who witnessed that day's events, the most important lesson had already been learned. Sometimes the most capable warriors are those who choose to serve quietly, without fanfare, until the moment their true skills are desperately needed.